CHAPTER 1 of Book 3 of Rhetoric. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. Rhetoric by Aristotle. Translated by Thomas Taylor. Chapter 1 of Book 3. There are three things which it is requisite to discuss concerning an oration. One, indeed, from what particulars credibility is derived; the second, about diction; and the third, in what manner it is requisite to arrange the parts of an oration. Concerning credibility, therefore, we have already spoken, and have shown from how many things it consists, and that it consists from three things. We have likewise shown what the nature is of these three, and why credibility consists from these alone. For all men are persuaded to believe what they hear, either because those who judge are themselves affected in a certain way, or because they conceive the speakers to be worthy of belief, or because the thing is proved. We have also spoken concerning enthymemes, and have shown whence they ought to be derived. For some things indeed are the species, but others the places of enthymemes. It now, however, remains to speak concerning diction. For it is not only sufficient to know what ought to be said, but it is likewise necessary to speak in a proper manner. And diction contributes greatly to the quality of the oration. The parts of rhetoric therefore were investigated by the ancients in that order in which they are naturally arranged. But from the nature of a thing we ought in the first place to discover those things which are adapted to persuade. In the second place, these are to be disposed, i.e. expressed by an appropriate diction. And that which is to be considered in the third place, and possesses the greatest power, though it has not yet been discussed by any one, is what pertains to pronunciation or action. For this was but lately introduced into tragic poetry and rhapsody. For at first the poets themselves acted the tragedies which they composed. It is evident, therefore, that with respect to rhetoric, there is a thing of this kind, in the same manner as with respect to poetry, which has been discussed by certain other persons, and by Glauco and Tyon. Pronunciation, however, or action consists in the voice, and the principal artifice of action consists in knowing how it is requisite to use it to each of the passions. Thus, for instance, it is necessary to know when the voice should be loud, when soft, and when between both; how the tones of voice should be employed, such as the acute, the grave, and the middle; and what rhythms are adapted to each of the passions. For there are three things which the writers on pronunciation consider, and these are magnitude, harmony, and rhythm. And as in poetical contests, those who excel in action, for the most part obtain the prize, and the players now excel in it more than the poets themselves. Thus also in forensic contests, through the depravity of politics, those orators gain their cause who excel in action. The art, however, concerning rhetorical action has not yet been disclosed, since, likewise, the art concerning diction was discovered late. And it appears to be but a slight thing, if it is well examined. But since the business concerning rhetoric pertains to opinion, we must pay attention to it, not as a thing possessing rectitude, but as necessary, since it is just not to require more in an oration than that it may neither give pain nor delight. For it is just to contend strenuously for things themselves, so that other things besides demonstration are superfluous. At the same time, however, diction is capable of producing great effects, as we have said, through the depravity of the hearer. Diction, therefore, possesses a certain small necessity in every discipline. For it is of some consequence with respect to the declaration of a thing to speak in this, or in that manner, yet it is not very important. But all these things, i.e. whatever pertains to rhetoric, depend on the imagination, and are referred to the hearer. Hence, no one teaches geometry in this way, viz. so as to be solicitous about diction. The art, therefore, concerning pronunciation, when it is employed, produces the same effect as acting on the stage. But some persons have endeavoured to speak a little concerning it, as for instance Thrasymachus in his treatise on Compassion. And to be disposed to act is natural, and more inartificial, but diction is artificial. Hence again, rewards are given to those who excel in it, in the same manner as to those rhetoricians who excel in pronunciation. For written orations possess greater strength from diction than from the sentiments they contain. The poets, therefore, gave rise to diction, as it is natural they should. For names are imitations, and of all our parts, voice is the most imitative. Hence the poets invented the poetical arts, viz. Rhapsody, or epic poetry, and the art of acting, or dramatic poetry, and the other arts. Because, however, the poets, though they sing of frivolous things, appear to have acquired their renown from diction. On this account poetic diction, such as that of Gorgias, was introduced by orators. And even now many of the unlearned fancy that those persons speak most beautifully when they speak poetically. This, however, is not the case, but the diction of an oration is different from that of poetry. And this is evident from the event. For the present writers of tragedies do not any longer employ the ancient poetic diction, but as from tetrameters they betook themselves to iambic verse, because this measure is of all others most similar to discourse. Thus also they rejected such names as are foreign from familiar conversation. Those likewise who at present compose hexameter verses have rejected the names with which the first dramatic poets adorned their verses. Hence it is ridiculous for those to imitate these poets who no longer employ that mode of diction. Hence too it is evident that we are not accurately to discuss every thing which may be said concerning diction, but only such things as pertain to rhetorical diction. For of poetical diction we have spoken in the treatise on poetry. CHAPTER 2. Let, therefore, what we have written in the Poetic be surveyed, and let the virtue of diction be perspicuity, of which this is an indication, that speech does not effect its proper work unless it renders manifest the mind of the speaker. Another virtue of diction is, that it be neither low nor above its dignity, but appropriate. For poetic diction perhaps is not low, and yet is not adapted to an oration. But of nouns and verbs, such as are proper render the diction perspicuous. Such other names, however, as are mentioned in the Poetic, cause the diction not to be low, but ornamented. For the introduction of unusual words makes the diction appear more venerable, since men are affected in the same manner towards diction, as they are towards strangers and their fellow citizens. Hence it is necessary to render the dialect foreign. For we admire the language of foreigners, and that which is admirable is pleasant. In metre, therefore, the poet does this frequently, and there it is appropriate. For both the verse and the subjects of the verse are very remote from common occurrences. But in prose, much fewer foreign words are to be used. For there, if either a slave, or a very young man, or one who speaks of very trifling things, uses elegant language, it is more indecorous. But in the language of these persons, the becoming consists in an appropriate contraction and dilation. Unusual words, however, should be introduced by the orator latently, and he should not seem to speak fictitiously, but naturally. For natural diction is adapted to persuade, but the fictitious has a contrary effect. For we avoid those who speak fictitiously as insidious persons, in the same manner as we avoid mixed wines. Thus the voice of Theodorus was preferred to the voice of other actors, for his seemed to be the voice of the speaker, but the voice of the others appeared to be foreign. Unusual terms, however, will be well introduced latently, if he who frames a speech makes a selection from the accustomed dialect, which Euripides does, and was the first that showed the way to others. But since an oration consists from nouns and verbs, and nouns have as many species as are enumerated in the treatise on poetry, of these species, nouns taken from various tongues or dialects, and also such as are double and fictitious, are seldom, and but in few places to be used. Where however they are to be used, and why but seldom, we shall afterwards show. For they produce a greater change in the language than is becoming. But the proper, the appropriate, and metaphorical, are alone useful to prosaic diction, of which this is an indication, that all men in common conversation use these alone. For all men speak in metaphors, and in appropriate and proper terms. Hence it is evident, that if any one does this well, his diction will be foreign, and it may be latent that it is so, and he will speak with perspicuity. But this was defined by us to be the virtue of a rhetorical discourse. Of names or nouns, however, the homonymous are useful to the sophist. For through these they deceive, but the synonymous are useful to the poet. I call however proper and synonymous terms such as to go and to walk, for both these are proper and synonymous to each other. What therefore each of these is, how many species there are of metaphor, and that metaphors can do much both in poetry and prose, we have shown, as we have before observed, in the treatise on poetry. But it is so much more necessary to labour about these in prose, because it has fewer aids than verse. A metaphor also especially possesses the clear, the pleasant, and the foreign, and it is not to be taken from another person. It is necessary, however, to use epithets and metaphors that are appropriate, and this adaptation will be obtained from the analogous. But without this there will be an apparent indecorum, because contraries are especially conspicuous when placed by each other. As a purple garment, therefore, becomes a young man, but not an old man, for the same garment is not adapted to both. Thus also certain metaphors and epithets are adapted to some things, but are not adapted to others. If likewise you are willing to praise, the metaphor must be derived from that which is better in the same genus. But if to blame, it must be derived from things which in the same genus are inferior. I say for instance, since contraries are in the same genus, to say, that a beggar prays, and that he who prays begs, because both are petitions, it is expedient to do as we have said. Thus Iphicrates called Callias Metragyrtes, or collector to the mother of the gods, and not Daducos, or torchbearer. But Callias replied, that Iphicrates was not initiated, otherwise he would not have called him Metragyrtes, but Daducos. For both these offices pertain to the goddess, but that of torchbearer was honourable, and that of collector ignoble. The flatterers of Dionysius also employed the same artifice, for they called themselves artists. Both these words, however, are metaphors, the one indeed of things sordid, but the other the contrary. And robbers at present call themselves exactors. Hence we may be allowed to say, that he who acts unjustly errs, and that he who errs acts unjustly, and also that he who steals both takes and robs." There is however an indecorum in what Telephus in Euripides says of certain rowers, that they reigned over oars and descended into Mysia." For the word to reign is greater than the dignity of the matter, i.e. of an oar. He does not therefore conceal his artifice. There is also an error in syllables, unless they cause the words to have a pleasing sound. And this error was committed by Dionysius, surnamed Chalcus, in his elegies. For he calls poetry the clangour of Calliope, because both are vocal sounds. But the metaphor is bad, which is made from sounds that are not significant. Farther still, nouns are not to be far*fetched, but things which are anonymous are to be denominated by words derived from things that are allied, and of the same species, and which show as soon as they are uttered that they are allied, as in the celebrated enigma, I saw a man agglutinating brass to a man with fire. For the passion is anonymous, but both are a certain addition. The enigma, therefore, calls the application of the cupping glass an agglutination. And in short, from enigmas that are well composed, good metaphors may be assumed. For metaphors have an obscure meaning, so that it is evident that an enigma, if it is approved, consists of metaphors that are well made. Metaphors also must be assumed from beautiful things. But the beauty of a name consists, as Lyceum says, in sounds, or in the thing signified, and in a similar manner the deformity of a name. Farther still, there is a third thing, which solves a sophistical argument. For that which Bryson says is not true, that no one speaks obscurely, since the same thing is signified by using this name instead of that. For this is false, since one name is more proper and more assimilated than another, and is more adapted to place the thing before our eyes. Again, this name and that signify a thing not similarly subsisting, so that thus also one name must be admitted to be more beautiful or more deformed than another. For both names, indeed, signify the beautiful and the deformed, but not so far as beautiful, or so far as deformed. Or both signifying the same thing, but in a greater or less degree. Metaphors, however, are hence to be derived from things which are beautiful, either in the voice, or in the power of signification, or to the sight, or some other sense. But it makes a difference to say, for instance, the rosy-fingered morn, rather than the purple-fingered, or, which is still worse, the red-fingered. In epithets also, appositions may be made from what is vile or base, as for instance the matricide. But the apposition may be made from that which is better, as the avenger of his father. And Simonides, when he who conquered with mules offered him a small reward, was unwilling to compose verses on the occasion, as disdaining to celebrate in verse semi-asses. But when he had given him a sufficient reward, then he sung, Hail daughters of the steeds that fly, with feet like whirlwind swift, though they were also the daughters of asses. Farther still, a thing may be praised or blamed by employing diminutives. But diminution is that which renders both evil and good less. Thus Aristophanes in his Babylonics calls in derision crucian (a golden thing), crucidarian, and imation (a garment), imatidarian. He also calls loidoria (slander), loidorimation, and nosema (disease), nosemation. In both appositions, however, and diminutives, it is requisite to be cautious, and to observe a mediocrity. CHAPTER 3. Frigidity may be produced in diction in 4 ways. In the first place, in double nouns, i.e. in compound words. As in Lycophron, when he says, the many-faced heaven, the mighty-topped earth, and the narrow-mouthed shore. And as Gorgias calls some one a beggarly-mused flatterer, and those who take an oath improperly or properly epiorchasantes, and catorchasantes. And as Alcidamas, when describing some one who was in a rage, his soul was full of ardour, but his face was of a fiery colour. And speaking of the promptitude of a certain person to fight to the last, he calls him telesphorus, or enduring to the end. He likewise calls the power of persuading telesphoros, and the bottom of the sea quanachrun, or azure coloured. For all these expressions appear to be poetical from duplication. This therefore is one cause of frigid diction. Another cause arises from the use of ancient words. Thus Lycophron calls Xerxes Pelorion Andra, or an immense man ; and Sciron he calls Sinnis Anear, or a pernicious man. Alcidamas also, speaking of poetry, says no such atherma or puerile sport is useful to poetry. And speaking of nature, he uses the expression adastalia or improbity. And of a certain person he says, That he was exasperated with the untamed anger of his mind." In the third place, diction may become frigid from using epithets which are either long, or unreasonable, or frequent. For in poetry it is becoming to say white milk. But in prose, epithets are partly more unbecoming, and partly, if they are too frequent, they cause prose to appear to be verse. Epithets, however, are sometimes to be used in prose ; for they render the diction more unusual, and cause it to be foreign. But mediocrity must be regarded in the use of them ; since otherwise a greater evil is produced than by speaking casually. For casual diction is not good, but the other is bad. Hence the writings of Alcidamas appear to be frigid ; for he uses epithets, not as seasonings, but as food, since they are so frequent in his writings, so great, and so apparent. Thus for instance, he does not merely say sweat, but moist sweat ; and he does not say that some one went to the Isthmia, or solemn games in honour of Neptune, but to the general assembly of the Isthmian games. Thus too he does not say the laws, but legal institutes, the queen of cities. Nor does he say in running, but with the rapid impulse of the soul ; nor museum, but receiving the museum of nature ; and the sad care of the soul, instead of merely saying care. Nor does he say favour, but the artificer of popular favour. And again he calls an orator the dispensator of the pleasure of his hearers. And he did not hide himself in the branches, but in the branches of the wood. And he did not cover his body, but the shame of his body. And desire the anti*rival of the soul. But this is at the same time a double word, and an epithet, so that it becomes poetical. Thus too, speaking of improbity, he says, the immense excess of improbity. Hence, those who speak poetically produce the ridiculous and the frigid, by their indecorous diction, and also occasion obscurity by their garrulity. For garrulity dissolves perspicuity, when it is introduced to him who knows the subject, by the obscurity which it occasions. Men however use double or compound words, when a thing is anonymous, and the words may be easily joined, such as time wasting. But if this is done frequently, the diction becomes entirely poetical. Hence a double diction, i.e. compound words, are most useful to dithyrambic poets ; for the language of these is sonorous. But ancient names and dialects are more adapted to epic poets. For epic poetry is venerable and superb. And metaphors are most adapted to iambics ; for these, as we have before observed, iambic poets now use. Again, in the fourth place, frigidity is produced in metaphors. For there are indecorous metaphors, some indeed on account of the ridiculous, for comic poets also use metaphors ; but others are indecorous from being too venerable and tragical. Metaphors likewise are obscure, if they are far*fetched, as those of Gorgias, who calls certain things green and sanguineous. And you indeed have shamefully sown, and badly reaped these things. For this is too poetically said. Thus too Alcidamas calls philosophy the bulwark of the laws, and the Odyssey a beautiful mirror of human life. And again he says, Nothing of this kind introduces puerile sport in poetry." For all these metaphors from the causes already mentioned are unadapted to procure persuasion. But what Gorgias said on a swallow which dropped its excrement as it flew towards him, is the best of tragical metaphors. For he said, This is shameful, O Philomel." For if he said this to the bird, the action was not shameful, but to a virgin it was shameful. His defamation therefore was proper, because he alluded to what the bird had been, and not to what it then was. CHAPTER 4. An image also is a metaphor, for it differs very little from it. For when Homer says of Achilles, He like a lion rushed, it is an image. But when he says, the lion rushed, it is a metaphor. For because both are brave, he calls Achilles metaphorically a lion. An image also is useful in prose, though but rarely, for it is poetical. Images, however, are to be introduced in the same manner as metaphors, for they are metaphors, differing in the way we have already mentioned. But images are for instance such as what Androtion said on Idrieus, that he resembled whelps freed from their chains, for they bite any one that falls in their way, and Idrieus when freed from his bonds was morose. And as Theodamas assimilated Archidamus to Euxenus, who was ignorant of geometry, and this from the analogous. For Euxenus is the geometrical Archidamus. Another instance of similitude is from the 5th book of the Republic of Plato, that those who in battle plunder the bodies of the dead are similar to whelps who bite stones, but do not touch those who throw them. And in the 6th book it is said of the people, that they resemble a strong, but deaf pilot. And in the 10th book, speaking of poetical measures, it is said, that they resemble those who are in the prime of life, but without beauty, for these in the decline of life, and verses when they are dissolved, no longer appear the same. Another instance is that of Pericles on the Samians, that they resembled children who take their food crying, and on the Boeotians, that they resembled flints, for flints are struck against each other, and the Boeotians fight with each other. Another instance is that of Demosthenes on the Athenian people, that they resembled those who are seasick, and that of Democritus, who assimilated rhetoricians to nurses, who swallow the food themselves, and anoint the children with the spittle. And again that of Antisthenes, who assimilated Cephisytidas, who was a thin man, to frankincense, which delights while it consumes. For all these similitudes may be used both as images and as metaphors, so that it is evident that such words as are approved and are used as metaphors will also be images, and likewise that images are metaphors which are in want of argument. It is always, however, necessary that a metaphor should be converted from the analogous, and be referred to the other part, and to things homogeneous. Thus if a cup may from analogy be called the shield of Bacchus, a shield also may appropriately be said to be the cup of Mars. From these things, therefore, an oration is composed. CHAPTER 5. The principle, however, of diction is to speak with propriety, and this consists in 5 things. And the first indeed is in conjunctives, if these are disposed in such a way as their nature requires, viz. So as to be placed in an order prior and posterior to each other. Thus for instance the conjunction indeed, and I indeed, require but, and but he. It must be remembered, however, that conjunctions which correspond to each other should neither be disjoined by a great interval, nor should have so many things interposed between them, that when a conjunction corresponding to a former one is given, the prior conjunction is forgotten. For this is appropriate but in few places. Thus, but I, after the thing was related to me, for Cleon came begging and entreating, went taking them along with me. For here many conjunctions are inserted prior to the conjunction which was to have been assigned. But if there is a great interval between but and I went, the sentence becomes obscure. One thing, therefore, requisite to correct diction is a proper disposition in the conjunctions. A second is, to call things by their proper names, and not to circumscribe them by generic and common names. A third is, not to use ambiguous words. But these precepts are to be observed, unless the contraries to them are preferred, which those do, who when they have nothing to say, pretend to say something. For men of this kind in poetry thus speak, as for instance Empedocles. For circumlocution deceives, if it be much, and the auditors are affected in the same manner as the multitude are by those who predict future events, since when they speak ambiguously, the vulgar assent to what they say. If Croesus passes over the river Halys, he will destroy a mighty empire. But the reason why, when we have nothing to say, we should use generic terms, is, because in short, the error will be less. And on this account, diviners speak through the genera of a thing. For in the game of even and odd, he will be less likely to err who says that a number is even or odd in general, than if he determines what number is so. And he who predicts that a certain event will be, is less likely to err if he only says that it will be, than if he assigns the time when it will be. Hence, those who deliver oracles do not define the time when a thing will happen. All these generic and ambiguous names, therefore, are to be avoided, unless they are adopted for the sake of some such purpose as we have mentioned. A fourth thing requisite to correct diction is, as Protagoras divided the genera of nouns into masculine, feminine, and instruments, or neuter, to employ these rightly, as, She coming and discoursing departed. A fifth requisite is to denominate rightly in many and few things, and in one thing, as, But they coming struck me. In short, it is requisite that what is written should be so written as to be read and pronounced with facility. But this is not the case when there are many conjunctions, and when what is written cannot be easily pointed. And such are the writings of Heraclitus. For it is laborious to point the writings of Heraclitus, because it is immanifest what should be conjoined with the prior or posterior part, as in the beginning of his book. For he there says, Of reason existing always men are ignorant, since it is immanifest whether the word always pertains to the prior or to the posterior part. Farther still, a solecism is produced in composition when to two words another appropriate word is not conjoined. Thus to noise and colour, seeing is not a common, i.e. is not an appropriate word, but sensible perception is common. The composition also is rendered obscure from the insertion of much which is intermediate, unless the part which corresponds to the first part of a sentence is immediately subjoined, and the rest added, as, My intention was, after I had mentioned such and such things to him, to go. But this obscurity would be avoided by saying, My intention was, after I had spoken to him, to go, and then to add, Having mentioned to him such and such things. CHAPTER 6. The following particulars contribute to the amplitude of diction. To use definition or description instead of a name, as instead of saying a circle to say, a plane figure in which all lines drawn from the middle to the circumference are equal. But the contrary contributes to conciseness, viz. To the use of the name instead of the definition. Amplitude of diction is also affected, if when anything disgraceful or indecorous is to be expressed, the name is used when the disgraceful thing is in the definition, but the definition if it is in the name. it is likewise effected by rendering a thing manifest by metaphors and epithets, avoiding at the same time what is poetical, and by causing one thing to be many, i.e. by using the plural instead of the singular number, which the poets do ; for when there is but one part, they nevertheless say, *' Into the Achaean parts," and instead of saying, " The complication of an epistle," they say, " The complications of epistles." Amplitude is also effected by separating what we can conjoin ; as, This woman, this our wife." But if we wish to speak concisely, we must say on the contrary, This woman our wife." And it is effected by using a conjunction. But if we wish to speak concisely, we must not employ a conjunction, yet the sentence must not be unconnected, as in the first case, " Going and speaking to him," and in the second, " Going, I spoke to him." The method of Antimachus likewise is useful for this purpose, viz. to enumerate particulars which a thing does not possess, which he does, speaking of the hill Teumessus ; for he says, A little hill there is, exposed to wind." For thus we may amplify to infinity. And this may take place both in what is good and what is bad, by enumerating what is not inherent, in whatever way it may be useful to the oration. Hence, also, poets derive the words chordless and lyreless melody ; for these words are derived from privations. But what we have just said is adopted in metaphors taken from the analogous, such for instance as to say, That the sound of a trumpet is a lyreless melody." CHAPTER VII. Diction, also, will possess what is decorous, if it is pathetic and ethical, and analogous to the subject matter. But the analogous is effected by neither speaking of things grand and magnificent slightly, nor of abject things venerably and magnificently, nor giving ornament to a vile appellation. For if this is not adopted, the composition will appear to be a comedy, which is the case with that of Cleon. For some things which he writes are just as if a man should say, A venerable fig." Diction becomes pathetic by reciting insolent behaviour in the language of an angry person. But when conduct has been impious and shameful, then the diction becomes pathetic, by speaking indignantly and cautiously. And when conduct has been laudable, this is effected by speaking with admiration. But in things of a lamentable nature, the pathetic is produced by a humble diction. And the like method must be adopted in other things. Appropriate diction, also, persuades to the truth of a thing. For the soul of the auditor is deceived by false reasoning, in consequence of conceiving that the orator speaks the truth, because the auditors are thus affected in such like orations. Hence they fancy that things are as the orator says, though they are not so. The auditor, likewise, becomes similarly affected with him who speaks pathetically, though he should say nothing to the purpose. Hence many astonish the hearers by the tumultuous manner in which they deliver their orations. Moreover, ethical diction is a demonstration from signs, because this when appropriate is consequent to every genus and habit. But I mean by genus, indeed, age, such as a child, or a man, or an old man ; sex, as man or woman ; and nation, as a Lacedaemonian or a Thessalian. And by habits I mean those things which produce the variety of conditions in life. For the lives of men are not such as they are according to every habit. If, therefore, the diction has appellations adapted to the habit, it will become ethical. For a rustic and a well*educated man will not say the same things, nor speak after the same manner. But the auditors are somewhat affected by that figure which the writers of orations abundantly use ; as, Who does not know this? All men know it." For the auditor from shame confesses that he participates of that knowledge of which every one else partakes. Opportune, however, or not opportune use is common to all the species. But the remedy in every hyperbole is that celebrated advice, self*correction. For it is necessary that the orator should correct himself; for the thing then appears to be true, though it may seem to be incredible, because the incredibility of it is not concealed from the orator. Farther still, every thing analogous is not to be used at once ; for thus the artifice will be concealed from the hearer. I mean, for instance, that if the names are harsh, yet must not the voice, or countenance, or other appropriate things, be such as to express that harshness ; otherwise it will become manifest what each of these is. But if the names are harsh, and the voice or countenance is not adapted to such names, the artifice will be latent. If, therefore, soft things be spoken harshly, and harsh things gently, they will lose the power of persuading. But epithets and compound words, if they are numerous, and especially such as are foreign, are adapted to him who speaks pathetically. For we pardon the orator, who when enraged calls some evil heaven*reaching, or immense. These epithets also and compound words may be used by the orator, when he has already moved the auditors, and inspired them with a divine fury, either by praising or dispraising, or by exciting them to anger or love ; which Isocrates does in his panegyric towards the end, where he has the words, Fame and memory," and those who endured." For those who are agitated with a divine fury speak things of this kind, so that auditors admit what is said, in consequence of being similarly affected. Hence, this form of diction is also adapted to poetry ; for poetry partakes of divine inspiration. Either, therefore, this form of diction must be adopted, in the cases already mentioned, or irony must be employed, as it was by Gorgias and Socrates in the Phaedrus of Plato. CHAPTER 8. With respect, however, to the figure of diction, it is necessary that it should neither be metrical, nor without rhythm. For metrical diction is not calculated to persuade ; for it appears to be feigned, and calls the attention of the auditor from the subject of the oration, since he is led to expect a metre similar to the former. As, therefore, when the criers proclaim to the people when a slave is manumitted by his master, What patron will he who is manumitted choose ? The boys antecedently to the crier exclaim, Cleon. Thus, if the oration were metrical, the auditors would preoccupy the orator, and would foresee what he ought to say. But the diction which is without rhythm is indefinite. It is necessary, however, that it should be bounded, though not by metre. For the infinite is unpleasant and unknown, and all things are bounded by number. But the number of the figure of diction is rhythm, of which metres are the segments. Hence, it is necessary that an oration should have rhythm, but not metre or measure ; for if it has, it will be a poem. It should not, however, possess rhythm accurately, but only to a certain extent. Of rhythms, however, the heroic indeed is venerable and sonorous, and requires harmony ; but the iambic is the diction of the multitude. Hence, in speaking, iambics are uttered the most of all measures ; but it is necessary that the prose of an oration should be venerable, and very exciting. The trochaic measure, however, is more analogous to swift dancing ; but this is evident from tetrameters, which are a voluble rhythm. The paean therefore remains, which was employed by orators, and originated from Thrasymachus. Yet they were unable to say what it was. But the paean is the third in order, and follows the above mentioned measures ; for it is in the ratio of 3 to 2, but of the others the one, i.e. the heroic, is in the ratio of 1 to 1, but the other, i.e. the iambic and the trochaic, in the ratio of 2 to 1. The sesquialter, however, is consequent to these two ratios, and the paean consists of this ratio. The other rhythms, therefore, are to be rejected from the above mentioned reasons, and because they are metrical, but the paean is to be assumed, for from this alone of all the rhythms we have mentioned, metre is not produced, so that it is especially latent. At present, therefore, orators use only one paean, and that at the beginning of their oration. It is necessary, however, that the end should differ from the beginning. But there are two species of paeans opposite to each other, of which one is adapted to the beginning of an oration, in which way also it is used by orators. But this is that paean in which the first syllable is long, and the other three are short, as Delos begotten, or Lycian, speaking of Apollo, and O golden-haired Hecate, daughter of Jove. But in the other paean, on the contrary, the first three syllables are short, and the last is long, as Night concealed after the land, the water, and the ocean. This paean, however, terminates the course of the oration. For a short syllable, because it is imperfect, causes the oration to be mutilated. But it is necessary that it should be amputated by a long syllable, and that the end of it should be manifest, yet not from the writer, nor from a paragraph, but from the rhythm. And thus we have shown that diction ought to have a proper rhythm, and should not be without rhythm, and also what the rhythms are, and how those subsist, that produce a proper rhythm in diction. CHAPTER 9. It is necessary, however, that diction should either be diffuse, and won by a bond, as the dilatations in dithyrambics, or that it should be periodic, and similar to the antistrophes of the ancient poets. Diffuse diction, therefore, is ancient, as in the work of Herodotus the Thurian, the beginning of which is, This is the exposition of history, &c. For this formerly all writers used, but at present it is not used by many. But I call the diction diffuse, which has of itself no end, till the thing which is discussed be brought to a conclusion. This diction is, however, unpleasant, on account of the infinite, for all men wish to see the end of a thing. Hence racers in the turnings round the goal are out of breath, and faint. But prior to this, when they have a prospect of the goal, their labour is not so extreme. Such, therefore, is diffuse diction. But periodic diction is that which consists of periods. I call, however, a period diction which has of itself a beginning and end, and a magnitude which may easily be perceived. But diction of this kind is pleasing, and easily learnt. It is pleasing, indeed, because it subsists in a way contrary to that which is boundless, and because the hearer always fancies he obtains something, because there is always something for him which is bounded. But it is unpleasant where nothing is foreseen, and nothing effected. It is also easily learnt, because it may easily be remembered. But it may easily be remembered, because this diction has number in the periods. Hence all men remember verse more easily than prose, for it has number by which it is measured. It is necessary, however, that a period should contain a complete, and not a mutilated and abrupt meaning, as in the iambics of Sophocles, Calydon, the land where Pelops reigned. For the contrary might be thought to be true by a division of the period, as in the above instance it would seem that Calydon is in the Peloponnesus. With respect to periods, however, one is in the colons, or members, but the other is simple. But the period which is in the colons is a perfect and distinct diction, and in which what is pronounced admits of easy respiration, and does not consist in a division, like the above mentioned period of Sophocles, but is a whole and entire. But I call the period simple, which consists of one colon. It is necessary, however, that the colons and the periods should neither be curtailed nor prolix. For when the periods are very short, they cause the hearer to stumble frequently. For the mind of the hearer, being impelled farther to the end which he had proposed to himself, stumbles as it were, when the orator stops short. But prolix periods cause the auditors to be left by the orator, just as those who in walking pass beyond the boundaries of their walk, for they leave their companions behind. In a similar manner, periods which are long become themselves an oration, and resemble diffuse diction. Whence that jest of Democritus the Chian upon Melanippides, who dilated in his writings instead of making antistrophes. This man frames evil for himself, in framing evil for another, but to dilate much is the worst of evils to him who does it. For a thing of this kind may be aptly said to those who use long colons. Very short colons, however, do not become periods. These, therefore, hurry away the auditor with them precipitately. But of periodic diction, which consists of many colons or members, one kind is distinct, and the other opposite. And the distinct, indeed, is such as the beginning of the panegyric of Isocrates. I have often admired those who collected public assemblies and instituted the gymnastic contests. But the opposite is that which consists of many colons, and in which either the same thing is composed with contraries, or contraries are composed with contraries, as in the panegyric of Isocrates. The Athenians benefited both those that remained at home and those that followed, for they acquired more for those that followed them, than they possessed at home, and they left sufficient for the support of those that stayed behind. Here the contraries are staying and following, sufficient and more. And again, in the same oration, so that to those who were in want of money, and to those who were willing to enjoy it, &c. Here enjoyment is opposed to acquisition. Farther still, it frequently happens in these things that prudent men are unfortunate, and the imprudent are prosperous. And immediately, indeed, they obtained the rewards of brave men, and not long after they became masters of the sea. Another example is, he sailed indeed through the continent, but walked through the sea. He joined the Hellespont, but dug through Mount Athos. And being citizens by nature, but by law deprived of a city. For some of them, indeed, perished miserably, but others were shamefully preserved. And privately, indeed, they used barbarian servants, but publicly overlooked many of their allies that were in slavery. And to have them when living, or leave them when dead. Or what a certain person said against Pitholaus and Lycophron in a court of justice, They sold you, indeed, when they were at home, but when they came to us they were themselves bought. For all these instances make the above mentioned periodic opposite diction. Diction, however, of this kind is pleasing, because contraries are most known, and when placed by each other are more known, and also because they resemble a syllogism. For an elenchus, or syllogism of contradiction, is a collection of opposites. A thing therefore of this kind is antithesis. But adequation takes place when the colons or members are equal, as the father died in battle, the son was married at home. And assimilation is when both the colons have similar extremes. But it is necessary that they should have similar extremes, either in the beginning or the end. And the beginning indeed has always similar nouns, but the end has the last syllables similar, or cases of the same noun, or the same noun. In the beginning indeed, the similar extremes are such as in the following instances, He received land from him, but it was uncultivated land, and appeased with gifts, and mollified with words. But the similar extremes in the end are, They did not think that he had brought forth a boy, but that he was the cause of his birth. In great cares, and in little hopes. Cases of the same noun are such as, But he deserves to have a brazen statue, though he is not worthy of brass, i.e. of a brazen coin. And an instance of the repetition of the same noun is, You while he was living defamed him, and now he is dead, right ill of him. But an instance when there is a similitude alone in the last syllable is, What evil have you suffered, if you have seen an indolent man? A period also may have all these at once, so as not only to consist of opposite, but also of equal, and similarly ending colons. The beginnings, however, of periods are nearly all of them enumerated in our Theodectean rhetoric. There are likewise false oppositions, such as Epicharmus made, Then I was one of them, then I was with them. CHAPTER 10. These things, therefore, being discussed, let us now show whence polite and the most approved diction is derived. To speak politely, therefore, is the province of an ingenious man, or of one who is exercised in elocution. But to show the sources from whence polite diction is derived belongs to this method, i.e. to rhetoric. We shall therefore unfold and enumerate what they are. Let the beginning, therefore, be this. To learn easily is naturally delightful to all men, but names signify something. Hence, such names as cause us to learn are most pleasing. Foreign tongues, therefore, are unknown, but proper words we know. Metaphor, however, especially causes diction to be polite. For when the poet says that Old age is stubble, he produces in us learning and knowledge through the genus, i.e. through the agreement of old age and stubble, since both produce a defloration. The image, therefore, of poets produce indeed the same thing, and hence if they are well employed, the diction will appear to be polite. For an image, as we have before observed, is a metaphor, differing from it in the collocation, on which account it is less pleasing because it is a longer simile, and it does not say this thing is that. Hence, in a metaphor, the mind does not investigate the similitude, i.e. its attention is not diverted from the object to which it is directed. That diction, therefore, and those enthymemes must necessarily be polite, which cause us to learn or produce in us knowledge rapidly. Hence, neither are superficial enthymemes approved, (for we call those enthymemes superficial, which are manifest to every one, and which require no investigation), nor such as when produced are not understood, but those only render the diction polite which are understood as soon as they are uttered, though there was no previous knowledge of them, or which shortly after lead us to the knowledge of something of which we were ignorant. For by the latter enthymemes discipline is, as it were, produced, but by no means by the former. Enthymemes, therefore, of this kind are approved from the sense of meaning of the diction. Urbanity, however, is produced in the figure or form of the diction, if contraries are opposed to contraries, as in the oration of Isocrates de Pace, And they thought that the peace, which is common to the other Greeks, was war to their own private affairs. For here war is opposed to peace. Urbanity also is produced in names or words, if they are metaphorical, and the metaphor is neither foreign, for this is difficult to understand, nor superficial, for this does not affect the hearer. Farther still, urbanity in diction is produced if the thing itself is placed before the eyes ; for it is more necessary to see what has been, than what will be done. It is requisite, therefore, to pay attention to these three things, viz. Metaphor, antithesis, and energy. As, however, there are four kinds of metaphors, those are most approved which subsist according to analogy ; as when Pericles said, That youth perishing in battle was taken away from the city, just as if some one should take away the spring from the year. And as Leptines said of the Lacedaemonians, That the Athenians should not suffer Greece to be deprived of its other eye. Thus too Cephisodotus, when Chares was anxious to give an account of the Olympiac war, said indignantly, That while he endeavoured to give the people an account of his conduct, he kept them in a furnace. And the same person, once exhorting the Athenians to forage in Euboea, said, It was necessary that the decree of Miltiades should proceed to the Euboeic expedition. And Iphicrates, when the Athenians had made a league with Epidaurus and the sea coast, said indignantly, That they had deprived themselves of the viatica of war. And Pitholus called the Athenian ship, which was denominated Perillus, the club (Ropelon) of the people. He also called Cestus the granary of the Piraeum. Pericles likewise exhorted the Athenians to destroy Aegina, as the ophthalmi of the Piraeum. And Mericles, naming a certain worthy person, said, That he was in no respect more depraved than this person ; for with respect to him he had taken 3 per cent interest, but that he himself had taken 10 per cent. And the iambic of Anaxandrides upon his daughters that were a long time before they married, The virgins have passed beyond the appointed day of wedlock. To these may be added what Polyeuctus said on one Speusippus, who was a restless man and apoplectic, That he could not be quiet, though he was bound by fortune in the Pentasurigian disease. Cephisodotus likewise called 3-banked galleys various baking houses. But the dog, i.e. Diogenes, called taverns the Attic Vidicia. And Aetian said, That the Athenians had poured forth their city into Sicily. For this is a metaphor, and places the thing before the eyes. Aetion adds, That the Athenians had so poured forth their city into Sicily, that Greece vociferated. For this also is after a manner a metaphor, and places the thing before the eyes. Cephisodotus also exhorted the Athenians to beware, That they did not make their assemblies hostile congresses. And Isocrates said, That the sophists addressed themselves to those who run together in the public assemblies. And as in the funeral oration of Lysias, It was but just that Greece should cut off her hair on the tomb of those who died at Salamis, because her liberty was buried with their virtue. For if he had said, That it was but just Greece should weep in consequence of virtue being buried with those who died at Salamis, it would have been only a metaphor, and the thing would have been placed before the eyes. But the words, Liberty was buried with virtue, have a certain antithesis. And as Iphicrates said, The path of my oration is through the midst of the transactions of Chares. For this is a metaphor according to analogy, and the words, Through the midst, place the thing before our eyes. And to say, To call on dangers to give assistance to dangers, is to place the thing before the eyes, and is a metaphor. Another instance is that of Lycolian in defence of Chabrias, Neither will you revere his suppliant brazen statue. For this is a metaphor in the present time, but not always, and places the thing before the eyes. For he being in danger, the statue supplicates for him, and supplication is attributed to an inanimate statue, which is the property of an animated thing, and A monument of the works of the city," and They meditated by every possible way to have grovelling conceptions." For to meditate is to increase something. And again, That God enkindled the light of intellect in the soul." For both light and intellect accord in illuminating. And For we do not dissolve war, but defer it." For both deferring and a peace of this kind signify something future. And to say, That the compacts of peace are a trophy much more beautiful than those which are procured in war ; for the latter are obtained for things of small consequence, and through one fortune, but the former for every battle." For both a trophy and a compact are indications of victory, and That cities through the censure of men suffer great punishment." For punishment is a certain just injury. And thus we have shown how polite diction may be derived from metaphor according to the analogous, and from placing a thing before the eyes. CHAPTER 11. Recording in memory of.